Imagine this. You're a young black man, just trying to make your way through life, when out of nowhere, you're framed by two corrupt police officers for a crime you didn't commit. They plant drugs in your car and arrest you, thinking they've caught you red-handed. But what they don't know is that you're no ordinary man. You're an undercover CIA agent on a mission to expose the very corruption they think they control. What begins as a routine arrest quickly spirals into a battle for justice that no one saw coming. As the courtroom drama unfolds, the stakes grow higher, exposing lies, corruption, and a fight for the truth that will shake the entire justice system. Will you be able to outsmart those who thought they could control your fate? Stay tuned for a story that will leave you questioning everything. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. You won't want to miss the explosive twists ahead. The streets of Arlington, Virginia, lay quiet under the midnight sky, with only the faint hum of streetlights filling the otherwise still air. It had been a long day for Marcus Jennings, but as an undercover CIA agent, it was all part of the job. His latest mission was nearing its end, and he'd gathered the information he needed. The criminal network he'd infiltrated was on the brink of collapse. As Marcus drove through the sleepy town in his black sedan, his sharp eyes scanned every detail, his instincts constantly on alert. He was just a few blocks from his apartment when the unexpected happened. In an instant, blue and red lights flashed in his rearview mirror, and the sharp sound of sirens split the quiet night. It wasn't unusual for him to get pulled over while on the job. As an agent, he was trained to deal with situations like this. His hands gripped the steering wheel, but his heartbeat didn't increase, his mind already working through the possibilities. His focus remained steady. This wasn't just any ordinary stop. It wasn't even on his radar. Marcus did exactly what his training dictated. He slowed down, guided the car to the side of the road, and turned off the engine. His hand reached for the glove compartment to grab his documents, never once feeling any fear or panic. The officers were still a mystery, but he knew how to handle himself in these moments. Two police officers stepped out of the patrol car, their movements deliberate. Officer Kevin Holt was tall and imposing, his square jaw and purposeful strides making it clear he was accustomed to taking charge. Officer Derek Black, shorter and stockier, followed closely behind. Both wore the standard blue uniforms of the Arlington Police Department. Holt approached Marcus's window first, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he leaned down slightly. "Good evening, sir," he said in a tone of practiced authority. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" Marcus met his gaze without hesitation, his voice calm and composed. "No, officer. I wasn't speeding, and I made a full stop at the intersection." Holt's lips curled into a small, almost dismissive smile. "Actually, you failed to stop at that sign back there," he said, his voice carrying a subtle condescension. "That's a moving violation." Marcus's brow furrowed only slightly, but he remained calm. "I'm certain I stopped, officer. If you're mistaken, we can settle this another way." The officer's smile faltered as he examined Marcus's documents. Holt's eyes lingered on the license, taking in the local address on it. Marcus watched carefully, his mind still sharp, assessing every detail. He was being watched, scrutinized. Something was off, and he knew it. Without warning, Holt passed the documents back and gestured toward the rear of the vehicle. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "May I ask why?" "We've got reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances," Holt said, his tone now noticeably firmer. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Illegal substances?" he repeated, his mind now piecing together the situation. The setup was too neat, too calculated. This wasn't a random encounter. "I think you've made a mistake," Marcus replied, his voice unshaken. Holt's expression hardened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he gestured for Marcus to exit the car, and Sullivan, his partner, moved toward the back of the vehicle. A smug look crossed Sullivan's face as he theatrically opened the trunk. "There it is," Sullivan said with feigned surprise. "What do you know? A bag of powdery goodness." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. His mind was racing now. He knew the bag hadn't been there when he left his house. It had been planted, part of the elaborate trap that was being set for him. "Anything you want to tell us, sir?" Holt pressed, his voice dripping with false politeness. Marcus took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "I'll save my comments for the appropriate setting," he said, his words controlled. The officers exchanged a look. This was no longer a routine traffic stop. Holt's patience was wearing thin, and his partner's smugness was apparent. Sullivan moved in to cuff Marcus, a grin spreading across his face as he did. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute," Sullivan said, his voice mocking. Marcus allowed it. He wasn't concerned about the cuffs. He wasn't concerned about the arrest. What mattered was the bigger picture, the trap that had just been set, and the fact that the officers had no idea who they were dealing with. The ride to the police station was silent except for the occasional crackle of the radio and the low hum of the engine. Marcus sat calmly in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind his back, his face unreadable. The officers, still smug from what they thought was a victory, failed to realize that this wasn't just another simple arrest. Marcus wasn't just a man they had framed. He was an undercover CIA agent, and he had already sent a signal to his team. As the car pulled into the station, Marcus knew that this moment was about to shift. The game wasn't over, not by a long shot. The officers had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated him, but they wouldn't be laughing much longer. The storm was coming, and they had no idea how much trouble they were really in. The morning sun broke through the clouds as Marcus was led through the back halls of the Arlington police station, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. The officers who had arrested him, Holt and Sullivan, led him without a word, their footsteps echoing off the linoleum floors. Marcus, however, didn't show an ounce of fear. His mind was already 2 steps ahead, plotting his next move. He had been in tight situations before. This one was no different. It was just another game, and he knew how to play it. When they reached the holding area, Marcus was placed in a cold, dimly lit cell. The door clanged shut behind him, and the silence that followed was almost suffocating. He sat on the edge of the bench, his body perfectly still. He wasn't nervous. He was calm, focused, and ready. He had done his job, and now he would make sure that the truth came to light. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for every person who had been wrongfully accused, every person who had been overlooked or silenced by the system. He sat in silence for what felt like hours, his thoughts sharp and deliberate. He knew his team would be watching. His phone had already sent the signal. The wheels were in motion. He wasn't in this alone. The hours dragged by until a sudden noise broke the silence. The loud buzz of the cell block door unlocking. The clang of heavy boots echoed through the hallway as officers approached. Marcus stood and straightened his posture, ready for whatever came next. The door swung open, and Officer Sullivan stood in the doorway, his usual smug expression replaced by something more akin to unease. "You've got a bail hearing in a few hours," Sullivan said, his voice lacking its usual bravado. "But between you and me, I wouldn't get your hopes up. Judges around here don't take too kindly to drug traffickers." Marcus tilted his head slightly, meeting Sullivan's gaze. His voice was calm, unyielding. "Good to know." Sullivan's eyes flicked briefly toward the monitoring cameras, a small shift of discomfort crossing his face. Marcus could feel it. The officer was still confident in his capture, but he couldn't shake the growing suspicion that something was wrong. It wasn't just Marcus's calm demeanor. It was the way he carried himself. Something about him felt different. But Sullivan had no time to question his instincts. His priority was making sure Marcus stayed in that cell. "Enjoy your breakfast," Sullivan muttered, turning to leave. As the door slammed shut behind him, Marcus allowed himself a faint smile. Sullivan had no idea who he was dealing with. The officers may have thought they were in control, but they were wrong. They had underestimated him, and that mistake would cost them. Hours passed in that cold, empty holding cell. The quiet buzz of fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound that kept Marcus company. But even in silence, he was preparing. He was no stranger to high-pressure situations. His training, his years as an undercover agent, had taught him how to be patient, how to remain composed even when everything around him seemed to fall apart. And today, everything was about to come to a head. He had already sent out the signal to his team. His CIA colleagues knew what was happening, and they would be ready. But Marcus wasn't going to wait for his team to save him. He knew that when the time came, he would have to take control of the situation himself. The police had set their trap, but Marcus had already begun dismantling it. The clock was ticking, and he could feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about his freedom. It was about exposing everything that had been wrong with the system that had led to his wrongful arrest. As Marcus sat in his cell, waiting for the moment to come, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen when the truth came to light. Would the officers be held accountable? Would the system finally start to change? Or would the corruption and lies go on unchecked? The door to his cell opened, and Officer Keller, the rookie officer, stepped in. His expression was uncertain, his eyes flicking nervously toward Marcus. "You don't seem worried," Keller said, his voice faltering slightly. "Most people would be freaking out by now." Marcus met his gaze, his voice calm and controlled. "Should I be?" Keller's eyes shifted uncomfortably as he looked down the hallway. He wasn't sure what he was doing here, or why he was talking to Marcus, but something didn't sit right with him. He had seen enough in his short time at the station to know that this wasn't just a routine arrest. There was something off about the whole situation. "Look," Keller said, his voice low. "I know you're not who they say you are. I know something's wrong here, but I can't just walk away from this. I'm new to this job, this station. I don't know who I can trust." Marcus stood up slowly, his gaze unwavering. "The truth is right in front of you, Officer Keller. You just have to decide whether you're willing to see it." Keller hesitated, his fingers twitching nervously by his side. Marcus could see the conflict in his eyes. The young officer was caught between his duty to his colleagues and the growing realization that the system he had joined was broken. But would he act on his doubts, or would he turn a blind eye like so many before him? The moment of reckoning was fast approaching. Marcus knew it, Keller knew it, and the officers who had framed him would soon realize just how wrong they had been. The tension in the air was palpable. Marcus had been sitting in his holding cell for hours, his mind running at full speed. He had been through countless missions before, each one filled with its own unique set of challenges, but nothing had ever felt like this. Every moment that passed brought him closer to his goal, exposing the corruption that had been allowed to flourish in the Arlington Police Department. The officers who thought they had framed him, who thought they could destroy his life, had no idea what they were up against. In the dead of the night, the door to Marcus's cell opened once again. This time, it wasn't Officer Sullivan or Holt. Instead, a younger officer, Officer Keller, stepped inside. His face was drawn, a mix of uncertainty and confusion etched into his features. The doubt that had been growing in him for the last few hours was now impossible to ignore. "You're not like the others," Keller said, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Marcus met his gaze calmly, his posture still and composed. "No, I'm not." The room was silent for a moment, with Keller hesitating as though weighing his words. The decision he was about to make was one that could change everything for him. Marcus knew that this moment was critical. He couldn't afford to let it slip by. "I don't get it," Keller muttered. "Why are you so calm? You're facing charges for trafficking drugs, and yet you act like you have everything under control." His voice faltered slightly, revealing the uncertainty he was feeling. Marcus stood, his hand still cuffed behind him, but his gaze unwavering. "Because I do have everything under control," he said, his voice steady but laced with intensity. "You see, I'm not who they say I am, and I'll prove it." Keller frowned. "How are you going to do that?" Marcus took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Keller's. "What if I told you this whole thing is a setup? What if I told you that these so-called drugs in my car weren't there when I left my house? What if I told you I'm not just some average person caught in a bad situation, but someone who's been undercover for months, exposing corruption in this town?" Keller's eyes widened, but he didn't interrupt. Marcus continued, "The officers who arrested me, they planted the drugs. and they think I'm just some guy they can arrest and walk away from. But I'm not just some guy. I'm about to expose everything they've done. All of it." There was a long pause. Keller stood frozen, caught in the web of the words that had just been thrown at him. He didn't know what to believe. This was unlike anything he had ever encountered on the job. There had been other officers with doubts about their colleagues' methods, but they had never dared to speak up. Keller was different. He had already felt the pangs of conscience as he watched the smugness of Holt and Sullivan. Now Marcus's words had planted a seed in his mind, a seed that was growing quickly. "You're lying," Keller finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. "There's no way you're telling the truth." Marcus shook his head, a slight smile playing on his lips. "You want to know the truth, Keller? You've already seen it. You just didn't recognize it yet." Before Keller could respond, Marcus glanced at the surveillance camera positioned above them, the faint red light blinking in the corner of the room. "You think they're watching you? They're watching me. And soon, they'll be watching their own downfall unfold. But you don't have to wait until then. You could help me now." Keller's brow furrowed, and he took a step back, conflicted. The words from his training, the rules he had followed all his life, told him to walk away from this. He wasn't supposed to get involved in something like this. But the unease, the questions that had started to plague him, now burned hotter in his chest. He could see the cracks in the story. He could feel the weight of the evidence Marcus had hinted at. But before Keller could process it all, the door to the holding cell opened. Officer Holt walked in, his jaw tight and his eyes cold. He gave Keller a stern look, a silent order to stop questioning Marcus. "We've got enough to deal with, Keller," Holt said, his voice clipped. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Keller hesitated, looking between Holt and Marcus. Holt's presence was heavy, and for a split second, Keller felt the weight of his decision pressing on him. He knew what he had to do, but the consequences of going against his partner were enormous. "Why don't you get out of here, Keller?" Holt added, his voice low and warning. "We'll handle this from here." Keller glanced one last time at Marcus, his eyes searching for an answer. Marcus nodded slightly, as if giving him permission to leave. Reluctantly, Keller turned and walked out of the room. As he stepped into the hallway, he felt a weight settle in his stomach. He knew the truth now, and there was no going back. The moment Keller left, Holt's smugness returned. He stood in front of Marcus, a twisted smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "You think you've won? You haven't even begun to see what's coming for you. This station doesn't care about you, Marcus. You're just another name in the system, and we're going to make sure you stay there." Marcus didn't flinch. He had been through worse, and he wasn't about to back down now. His eyes locked onto Holt's, unwavering. "Your little game is over," Marcus said, his voice calm but deadly serious. "Soon, everyone in this station will see the truth. And when they do, it won't be me behind bars, it'll be you." Holt's grin faded, but before he could respond, a sudden interruption echoed through the station. An alarm, sharp and unyielding. The lights flickered briefly, and the building seemed to shake. Marcus's heart raced, but this time, not in fear. Something was happening, and he could feel it in his bones. The alarm wasn't part of the plan. Someone had just made their move. The storm was coming. The day had dragged on, but Marcus's mind was sharp, unwavering, and focused. He had been sitting in that cold holding cell for what felt like an eternity, but he never lost track of his mission. He was no longer just a defendant in a case. He was playing a much bigger game, one that stretched far beyond these walls. The police, his arrest, and the planted drugs, they were all part of a larger plan. But Marcus had been trained for moments like this. Nothing would shake him, and nothing would break his resolve. He had spent countless hours preparing for what was coming, meticulously reviewing every detail. He had anticipated every move, every obstacle, every challenge the prosecution and the police might throw at him. And now, the time had come to make his final move. The tension inside the police station was palpable, almost suffocating. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallways, and the low murmur of voices from the break room couldn't mask the palpable unease that lingered in the air. Marcus knew it wasn't just about him anymore. The storm he had been waiting for was finally here, and it would break wide open before the day was done. Just then, the door to his cell creaked open. It was Officer Holt, his expression steely and determined. Holt had been smug and confident when he arrested Marcus, but now there was a crack in that facade. The arrogance in his posture was gone. He had been the one to set the trap, but now the realization was dawning on him. Things were slipping out of control. "Marcus," Holt said, his voice harder than before. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? You think you can turn this around with your little games and your lies? You've made a mess of things." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He let the silence hang between them, allowing the weight of Holt's words to sink in. Holt had spent days trying to convince himself that he was in control, that he could bury Marcus and keep the truth hidden. But now, Holt could feel the cracks in his certainty. Marcus had been right from the start. This wasn't about him. It was about something much bigger. "I don't think I have it figured out, Holt," Marcus said, his tone calm, his voice like steel. "I know I have it figured out. You just don't like the fact that the truth is coming out." Holt's face flushed with frustration. He stepped closer, his jaw tightening. "You've made a mistake. You're just another criminal trying to weasel your way out of this." Marcus stood up, his hands still cuffed behind his back, his posture straight and confident. He wasn't afraid of Holt. In fact, he almost pitied him. "You're not the one who's going to make the calls here, Holt. You've been playing a game you don't understand, and you're about to lose." There was a long, pregnant pause. Holt's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Marcus saw doubt flicker behind them. Holt had always prided himself on his ability to manipulate the system, to bend it to his will. But now he was facing something he didn't understand, a force he couldn't control. "You're going to regret this," Holt spat, his voice cold with threat. "You're going to wish you'd just taken the plea deal. This is where it ends for you." Marcus didn't flinch. He knew what was coming, and he wasn't afraid of it. He had faced worse. "The only thing that's going to end, Holt, is your career, your lies, your entire system of corruption." Before Holt could respond, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed in the hallway outside Marcus's cell. The tension in the air shifted. Something was happening. The officer stationed at the desk seemed to grow agitated, whispers traveling through the station. Holt's gaze flicked toward the hallway, his expression darkening. "What's going on?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but filled with an underlying current of anticipation. Holt hesitated, his lips twitching with uncertainty. "It's nothing. Just a glitch in the system. Don't worry about it." But Marcus didn't believe him. He could feel it, the shift in the air, the nervous energy that had begun to spread. Something was happening, something big. And it wasn't just about his trial anymore. The system was beginning to crack. Just then, the door to the station's main entrance swung open. The sound of heavy boots hitting the floor grew louder, and Marcus caught a glimpse of federal agents in black suits entering the building. They moved with purpose, their presence commanding the room as they made their way to the front desk. A low murmur filled the air, and Marcus could see the change in Holt's expression. The agents were here for something far bigger than just him. The agents weren't there to arrest Marcus. They were there to take down Holt and his team. They had all the evidence they needed. As the agents made their way through the station, Marcus could feel the storm coming. It was no longer about him. It was about exposing the corruption that had poisoned the very core of the police department. Holt's world was about to come crashing down. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead felt almost deafening in the silence of the police station. The waiting had stretched on for hours, but Marcus didn't mind. He had been in tighter situations before, surrounded by people who thought they could control him, who believed they could break him with threats and intimidation. But Marcus Jennings wasn't the kind of man to be intimidated. His calm demeanor, the stillness in his eyes, it was a weapon in itself, a weapon he was prepared to use at the right moment. Outside the small holding cell, the station was alive with its usual noise. Officers walked by, speaking in low tones, the sound of a phone ringing in the break room, the clatter of keyboards as reports were typed up. But Marcus knew something was different today. The tension in the air was thick, almost palpable. It wasn't just because of his arrest. No, this was bigger than that. The federal agents had arrived. Marcus had been waiting for this moment, had been preparing for it. His instincts had kicked in the moment he realized that something was happening. The small, seemingly insignificant clues had started to build a bigger picture. The officers who had framed him, the arrogance, the casual planting of evidence, had no idea they were playing with fire. And Marcus was the one with the match. He stood up from the bench in his cell, moving slowly, deliberately. His wrists still stung from the cuffs, but it didn't matter. He was far from helpless. His CIA training had taught him to wait, to observe, to be patient. He had sent out the signal. He had prepared the groundwork. And now it was time for the truth to break free. As he stood there, staring through the bars of his cell, a shadow appeared in the hallway. He recognized the figure immediately, Officer Holt, the smug officer who had orchestrated his arrest, who thought he had won. But today, Holt wouldn't be the one walking away victorious. Holt's face had lost some of its earlier confidence. He looked more worn out, less sure of himself. There was a flicker of doubt in his eyes as he approached Marcus's cell. He glanced over at the two federal agents, standing in the hallway, just outside, watching everything unfold. "This isn't over, Marcus," Holt said, his voice strained. "You think the feds are going to swoop in and save you? You're wrong. You're in deeper than you realize." Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "It's over, Holt. You just don't know it yet." Holt laughed, but it was hollow, a forced sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You've got nothing, Jennings. No evidence, no backup. You're just a criminal trying to talk your way out of this." Marcus shook his head. "I've got everything, Holt. It's not me who's in trouble. It's you." The words hung in the air, but before Holt could respond, the door to Marcus's cell opened. A new presence filled the hallway, a federal agent in a tailored suit, his face stern but calm. He didn't look at Marcus at first. Instead, he turned to Holt and spoke in a voice that cut through the tension like a knife. "Officer Holt, I need to speak with you." Holt stiffened, but he didn't argue. He stepped back, his eyes narrowing at Marcus before he walked down the hallway with the agent. The door to Marcus's cell closed behind them with a loud clang, but Marcus remained unfazed. He could hear the muffled voices in the distance. Holt was trying to explain, trying to justify everything he had done, but it was too late. The feds were here, and they weren't going to let this go. A few moments later, the federal agent returned, his eyes locking onto Marcus. He nodded briefly to the officers in the hallway before approaching Marcus's cell. "You're Marcus Jennings?" the agent asked. "That's right," Marcus said evenly, his eyes sharp and alert. "I'm Agent Price," the man said, his tone no nonsense. "I've been briefed on your case. The situation here is more complicated than you think, but we're going to fix it." Marcus tilted his head slightly, curious but cautious. "How do you plan on fixing this?" Agent Price didn't flinch. "We've been monitoring the situation for a while. We know the officers involved, and we know the evidence has been tampered with. But we need you to testify, Marcus. We need you to help us expose everything." Marcus's heart rate barely increased, but he could feel the weight of the moment. This was it. The truth was finally about to be exposed. But he knew better than to be naive. There were always risks, always things that could go wrong. The system had been corrupted for far too long, and even the feds had their own flaws. "Fine," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But I want to make sure they're held accountable. Not just for me, for everyone they've hurt." Agent Price nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You'll get your chance. But first, we need to take them down." As Marcus was escorted from his cell, he couldn't help but feel the rising tide of change. He was about to walk out of this station a free man, but the storm was far from over. He could feel it, the shift in the air, the sound of boots on the ground as the feds closed in on the officers, who thought they had buried him. But just as they reached the station's front doors, a sudden crash of voices interrupted the calm. Holt and Sullivan were being dragged out of the interrogation room by two agents, their faces pale and terrified. The smug confidence they had carried for so long had shattered, replaced by fear and panic. "Marcus!" Holt shouted, struggling against the agents. "You don't know what you're doing. You can't expose us like this." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was already unfolding. And for the first time in this entire ordeal, Marcus felt a rush of vindication. The officers had thought they could get away with their corruption. But now, the tables were turning. He stepped out of the station, his head held high. But as he did, he felt a familiar sense of unease. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The system had been broken, but now Marcus had to make sure that the damage would be repaired. And that meant taking down the rest of the corrupt officers who had turned a blind eye to their own actions. As Marcus walked away, the weight of the moment hit him. The real battle was just beginning. The courtroom was packed with people. Some sat in the back, quiet, watching the unfolding drama, while others stood, their eyes glued to the proceedings. Marcus Jennings, once a mere defendant caught in the grips of a corrupt system, now stood at the center of a storm that would reshape everything. The days of questioning, the cross-examinations, and the overwhelming evidence that had come to light, everything had led to this moment. The federal agents had done their part, collecting the damning records, photos, and audio recordings that exposed not just the lies of Officer Holt and Officer Sullivan, but an entire network of corruption within the police department. The lies had been uncovered, and the truth was undeniable. The courtroom was alive with whispers. The jury had already been presented with the evidence. Marcus had made his case clear, his voice steady and unwavering as he told the jury what had happened, how he had been framed by two officers who thought they could get away with anything. They had planted evidence, lied under oath, and tried to ruin his life. But Marcus wasn't going to let them succeed. He had fought back, and the truth was coming to light. Now the prosecution was struggling to maintain control. District Attorney Emily Rhodes stood at the podium, her face tight with frustration. She had been confident in her case, believing that Marcus would never have the opportunity to defend himself, that the corrupt officers would have their lies go unchecked. But she hadn't anticipated the force that Marcus had become. She cleared her throat, looking at the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a tragic case. A man who should be locked away for good is instead standing here, accusing our officers of corruption. These officers have served their community for years, but one man's lies are threatening to destroy that reputation." But the jury wasn't listening. They had seen the footage. They had heard the testimonies. The evidence spoke for itself. Marcus Jennings wasn't the criminal, he was the victim. Marcus stood tall, his eyes never leaving the jury, his mind clear. He was no longer just a man accused of a crime he didn't commit. He was a symbol of resilience, a symbol of someone who had refused to be silenced by the corruption that had controlled his fate for so long. His defense had been more than just a battle for freedom. It was a battle for justice, for the countless others who had been wronged by the system. The corrupt officers thought they could manipulate the law, but Marcus had proven them wrong. He had stood up, representing himself, and had exposed everything they had tried to hide. The judge, Judge Laura Stevens, had watched the trial unfold with growing respect. At first, she had doubted Marcus. She had questioned whether a young man with no legal training could possibly have the knowledge or the ability to dismantle a case built by experienced prosecutors and corrupt officers. But as the trial went on, she couldn't deny it any longer. Marcus had outsmarted them all. And now, as the final moments of the trial approached, Judge Stevens looked at the jury with a weighty silence in the air. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, her voice calm but firm, "the evidence in this case has been thoroughly examined. The accusations against Mr. Jennings are indeed false. The actions of Officers Holt and Sullivan have been exposed for what they are: corruption, deceit, and abuse of power. Based on the facts, I have no choice but to declare Mr. Jennings not guilty of all charges." The room erupted. There were gasps, whispers, and even a few tears of relief. Marcus stood motionless for a moment, his eyes scanning the courtroom. He didn't smile. He didn't raise his arms in victory. He had already won. He had exposed the truth. That was all that mattered. The prosecutor, Emily Rhodes, stood there in stunned silence, her face pale as the verdict was read. Her case had collapsed. Her belief in the guilt of the officers had crumbled. She had underestimated Marcus, and now she had to face the consequences of her misplaced confidence. Marcus turned to his mother, Sharon Jennings, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, her face filled with both fear and pride. The relief was evident in her eyes as she locked onto her son, but Marcus didn't need her to say anything. The look in her eyes said it all. She had always believed in him, and now she saw the result of that belief. The jury filed out of the room, and the agents who had helped Marcus throughout the trial, those who had uncovered the corruption, watched him with silent approval. Marcus had done what they couldn't do alone. He had broken through the system that had tried to swallow him whole. As Marcus walked out of the courtroom, the buzz of reporters surrounded him. He was the center of attention now. His face would be plastered on headlines. His victory was won for the books, but it wasn't the end. No, the truth was bigger than him. The corruption he had exposed wasn't confined to just a few officers. It ran deeper. There were more officers like Holt and Sullivan, and Marcus knew that the fight didn't stop here. The agents who had supported him were already preparing for the next step. This was a first victory in what would likely become a larger operation to dismantle the corrupt practices within the department. They would bring more officers to justice, and they would make sure the lies never took root again. But before Marcus could walk away, Officer Holt, still cuffed and surrounded by agents, shot him one last, venomous look. "You haven't won yet, Jennings," he spat, his voice hoarse. "You think you've exposed everything? You've only scratched the surface." Marcus stopped in his tracks, turning toward Holt with a calm, yet determined expression. "You're right. This isn't over, but you will never see the end of it." As Holt was led away, Marcus glanced back at his mother and the agents, nodding quietly. He wasn't done. He knew this fight wasn't just for his freedom. It was for everyone who had been wronged. The truth had exploded in court, but it was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. This story may have concluded in the courtroom, but the battle for justice would continue. The aftermath of this case, how it would ripple across the department, the city, and beyond, was still unfolding. For Marcus Jennings, this was not a final victory, but the first step toward cleaning up a broken system. And as he walked away, he knew the next fight was already waiting for him. Marcus's journey reminds us that no matter how deep the lies, the truth will always find a way to rise to the surface. His fight wasn't just for his freedom. It was a battle for every person who's ever been wrongfully accused, every voice that's been silenced. If this story touched you, don't just watch, be part of the change. Like, comment, and subscribe to stay with us as we bring you more stories that matter. Together, we can ensure the truth is never hidden again. Thank you for being part of this journey.